different from a prurient interest, and that's telling because this test for video games has nothing to do with sex. The law mimicked the definition of obscenity, the three-part definition of obscenity, but didn't deal with sex at all. It dealt with violence. And the California law, the California legislature, when they enacted the law, said that it served two purposes. One, that it prevented violent, aggressive, and antisocial behavior as a result of having played the games. And second, that the law prevented psychological harm to the minors who play the games in terms of the effect on the child's brain. And the industry, of course, challenged the law as a violation of the First Amendment. It has challenged every law in every jurisdiction that has attempted to deal with violent video games and put the state to its proof on whether it could justify the law. California conceded early on in the litigation that it could not produce evidence that playing the games caused, in a cause and effect relationship, aggressive, violent, antisocial behavior. They didn't have the evidence. Yeah, there have been some studies that have been done over the years that indicate that there may be some causal effect, but it's not at all well established, not satisfactory proof in a court of law. One of the studies a long time ago was a Bozo the Clown, the little clown that you can knock over, and they had little kids watch, I think they were cartoons, there was some violence and chases and stuff like that, and the kids who watched the more violent cartoon were more likely to go over and take a pop at Bozo the Clown than the kids who didn't, or who watched the Bambi cartoon. But the proof that actual real-world behavior, antisocial, violent behavior, was caused by playing video games, the state could not produce that evidence, and so conceded that, but said that they did have sufficient evidence, at least to make an argument, that kids were harmed by playing the games, that the effect on their brain was harmful in some way. Well, the court went to the Supreme Court of the United States last year, decided the case on June 27th, and the surprising author of the decision was Justice Scalia, who, while he's always sarcastic, and he was exceptionally scornful of this law and its intent and effect. The main points of interest from our point of view are first that video games qualify for First Amendment protection. They're speech for First Amendment purposes. James Madison might have been surprised to learn that. This is not by any means political speech, but Justice Scalia says that popular entertainment, plays, fiction, movies, and games all communicate ideas, and they do so using similar devices like character, dialogue, and plot. Justice Scalia says it's difficult to distinguish entertainment from politics and dangerous to try. So the court is not going to create a category of popular entertainment that is less protected than core political speech. And the state argued in the video games case that violent video games, extremely violent video games, like the ones condemned by this law, where you maim people, blood gushes out all over the place, constitute a category of unprotected speech, a category like obscenity, which is doubtless why they used the obscenity three-part definition as the framework for outlawing violent video games. And the state says, well, violent video games are like obscene categories of speech that do not deserve First Amendment protection. Their social value, if any, is outweighed by their social costs in affecting the way minors think about the world. And Justice Scalia said, no, that contention is controlled by the Stevens case, by the depictions of animal cruelty case that the court had decided the previous year, where you remember the court said the depictions of animal cruelty constitute a category of unprotected speech, and the court, through Chief Justice Roberts, said, no, we're not creating new categories of unprotected speech, and we don't do balance of social value versus cost to decide whether something has First Amendment protection. So Justice Scalia says, no, you can't treat these video games as a unprotected category, and that means that conventional First Amendment analysis applies. And what you've got here is a content-based restriction on speech, targeting the content of violent video games and making the sale of them illegal if to minors. And that means that the government has to satisfy strict scrutiny, and the court looks to whether the state advances a compelling interest and whether the restriction is narrowly tailored to serve that interest. And Justice Scalia is not entirely clear in differentiating those two analytical points. With regard to compelling interest, I think he scoffs at the idea that the state's interest is compelling. There's no showing of actual harm here. There are no studies that show that the brain cells in a game-playing minor's brain have been badly affected, and whatever the studies do show are basically minimal effects, which are not distinguishable from the effects of watching Saturday morning cartoons, Bugs Bunny doing what look like violent things, running into walls and so on, and the effects of playing video games don't seem to be any different from watching violence on television, from watching violent movies, from reading books that graphically describe violence. So I think Scalia does not believe that the government has a compelling interest in limiting the availability of violent video games to minors, but he doesn't quite come out and say so. And he goes on in a narrow tailoring vein to point out that the law is under-inclusive. Here Scalia is quite sarcastic, as usual, saying that the state seems to be perfectly willing to leave this dangerous, mind-altering material in the hands of children, so long as one parent, or maybe an uncle or an aunt, thinks it's okay. Because with the parent getting the game for the kid, then the state's interest disappears. Seems under-inclusive. Scalia acknowledges that states have the power to protect children from harm, but no free-floating power to restrict the ideas to which children may be exposed. And then, in response to the state's attempted treatment of violence as analogous to obscenity, Scalia points out there is no tradition in our country of restricting children's access to depictions of violence. We've always had restrictions on obscenity, sexual material. We have no comparable historical tradition of limiting children's access to violent materials, pointing out that, for example, Grimm's fairy tales have a good deal of violence, the Odyssey, Dante, and so on. Justice Alito dissented, saying that playing games is quite different from reading Dante. Scalia says, yeah, reading Dante is unquestionably more cultured and intellectually edifying than playing Mortal Kombat. But these cultural and intellectual differences are not constitutional ones. Crudely violent video games, tawdry TV shows, and cheap novels and magazines are no less forms of speech than the Divine Comedy, and restrictions on them must satisfy strict scrutiny. Alito did a lot of homework on his own in the case. He was really morally offended by some of these games, and he found the violence astounding, in which victims were dismembered, decapitated, disemboweled, set on fire, chopped in little pieces, blood gushes, spatters, and pools. Sound familiar, Mark? You've been there, done that. Yeah. And I think revealed his own personal revulsion at the idea, at the moral ideas that seem to be taught by some of the games. He says, there's no antisocial theme that's too base for some in the video game industry to exploit. For example, some games allow you to reenact the Columbine massacre or the shootings at Virginia Tech, the assassination of President Kennedy, or to engage in ethnic cleansing by gunning down African Americans, Latinos, or Jews. Scalia is never left speechless. He reads Alito's dissent and he puts into his opinion, yeah, Alito recounts all these disgusting video games in order to disgust us. But disgust is not a valid basis for restricting expression. And I think that neither is the fact that some games teach immoral lessons a ground for restricting them, that it's fun to kill people who are different from you or innocent people and so on. And I think it's likely that both Justice Alito and the California legislature were animated more by their own moral objections to the lessons taught and the whole gestalt of the games than by the likelihood of real harm caused to minors by playing the game. We can lament the increasing coarseness of our society, but the idea is you got to vote with your feet. If you don't like what the games are doing, don't buy them, don't use them, don't rely on government to police ideas. Actually, Alito's opinion was not a dissent, it was a concurring opinion, because he and Chief Justice Roberts thought that the law was unconstitutional because it was vague, because the terms about appealing to deviants and morbid interests and so on created an impermissible vagueness in the law, which meant that there was no fair notice to people who would make and sell the games of what would be illegal, that the definition wasn't specific enough. And the vagueness, I think, was compounded by lumping all minors together, as though they were monolithically affected by playing the game. A 5-year-old would be affected in the same way as a 17-year-old, which obviously is not true. And Justice Alito and the Chief thought that the court should not foreclose a better written statute to deal with what is a potentially serious social problem, the effect of exceptionally violent video games on impressionable minors, who often spend countless, this is sort of the moral judgment that Alito brings to bear, spend countless hours immersed in the alternative worlds that these games create. Justice Breyer, of all people, supposed liberal, dissented. He would give the state the benefit of the doubt on these studies, psychological studies that show some effect on aggressiveness and so on. He acknowledged that no causal effect had been shown and that the studies were contradictory, but he said that the state should nonetheless be allowed to rely on them. So that's 7-1, and the other one is Clarence Thomas, making it 7-2. He dissents from his originalist brother, Scalia's opinion, on originalist grounds, and said, he goes back into history and says that at the time the First Amendment was written, the framers would not have allowed speech to reach children bypassing their parents, that parents had an absolute right to control what their minors would see, and that they couldn't have been, you couldn't communicate with children without going through their parents, giving them information their parents didn't want them exposed to. He would have treated video games as a category of unprotected speech. But Scalia disagreed with his history. He didn't abandon his own originalist viewpoint, but he didn't agree with the historical analysis, and he said, in any event, the California law didn't enforce the power of parents over what their children get to see. It supplanted parental authority with government authority, which is never a good idea. We can talk briefly about the lineup of the Supreme Court, which was very bizarre in this case, on Tuesday, and then we'll do a review for the midterm. So whatever questions you have about everything we've done up till now, bring them in on Tuesday.